Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Preston Shipp. Preston is a former appellate prosecutor for the Tennessee Attorney General's office, and he recently published a book, Confessions of a Former Prosecutor, Abandoning Vengeance and Embracing True Justice. Welcome, Preston.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here with you.
So it's very interesting. I was reading the book by Cyntoia Brown, and she was taking classes at the prison in a rather unique program that I'll let you describe in a moment. When she gets her appeal rejected, and there on the signature line is your name. And what struck me immediately is that you really didn't react like I would have expected you to have. And understand, I'm coming at this from the perspective of reading her book first, not your book. But you didn't react like I think most prosecutors would have. Most prosecutors that I know are all about doubling down on kind of whatever they've decided. What's going on with you that made you react differently?
Well, that's a great question. I think that lawyers and prosecutors especially are prone to thinking that we're always right all the time. I think that lawyers, especially prosecutors, can sort of be driven by ego. I think that there can be some narcissism involved, and that sounds terrible, to say out loud. And certainly, I know so many prosecutors who are not driven by ego and who are not narcissistic, who are doing it for the right reasons. They want to cultivate truer, deeper justice. But, lawyers like to argue, at least trial lawyers do, and lawyers like to have a cause, whatever side, we're on, and that's how you're an effective litigator is by believing in your cause, believing that you are right. And as prosecutors, when we're arguing about the fate of people that we don't know, and when we're armed basically with only information about the worst moment of their lives, and we have victims who are looking to us and communities who are looking to us to try to assure them that, hey, justice has been done here, you're safe. That lends itself to, sort of like wearing a suit of armor. And you need to believe that you're right, because if you don't believe all the way down to your toenails that you are right, how are you going to sleep at night? If doubt creeps in, if there are chinks in that armor, and you start thinking, well, maybe that wasn't the best outcome for this case, or maybe there was a reasonable doubt, or maybe there was a legitimate defense, here. How are you going to live with yourself? You have to believe that you're right, to move on to the next case. And unfortunately, a part of that is, believing sometimes, the absolute worst about the person responsible in the case. For me, I think what makes me different, it's nothing intrinsically different about me, I don't think. It's that I had the luxury, by virtue of that college prison program that you mentioned that Lipscomb University offered, I had the luxury of and privilege and honor of being in close proximity to people who were caged, essentially. I got to know them in a way that few prosecutors do. I got to hear details of their lives that few prosecutors hear. I got to hear their stories. I got to be friends with them, and I started rooting for them because, they weren't monsters. They weren't bad people. they were good people, who had great potential to do more good and to, lead and serve as mentors. And I'd be happy to get into, some of the things that these folks are doing, but I think that that proximity softened me up, so that I was able to reflect a little bit more maybe than I otherwise would have, take off the blinders that might otherwise have stayed in place, um, and sort of repent, and think differently about justice, about my role in the system, and about even the legitimacy of that system.
Yeah, and I've had similar experiences. Nothing as quite stark as you've had, but I work with incarcerated people on journalism projects, and I teach them journalism. And I've had kind of the same experience that, you get to know people, and all of a sudden you're like, this person really doesn't belong in here. And I understand, not everybody's innocent, and not everybody has as dramatic a story as Cyntoia, but a lot of these people, they made mistakes when they were young. They came from broken homes. They were victims themselves at one point, and they did something really bad. But they're not that person anymore. And we've kind of, I think, as a society, we feel more comfortable putting that label on. Hey, they're a criminal. They're a monster. And that's what lets us sleep at night, because we can lock them up and make ourselves safe.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think we have to sort of recognize that tendency. I don't know if it's a universal human tendency, but certainly within our culture, there's a tendency to, as you mentioned, slap a label on somebody, look only at the worst thing that they have done, and not regard them really as anything more than that, um, and close off your feelings of compassion for that person and your desire to see that person grow and experience redemption. I mean, we love redemption stories, but for some reason, when someone commits a violent crime, a crime that shocks us, makes us feel afraid, it's like we want to foreclose on the hope of redemption. And I think that is very contrary to, the subtitle of the book, Abandoning Vengeance and Embracing True Justice. I think compassion is a necessary component of true justice, that you never create so much distance between yourself and the person who caused this harm, that you foreclose on compassion. And I think about Father Greg Boyle, with Homeboy Industries, whom I quote in the book. He talks about how what we really ought to be doing is cultivating so much compassion. In his instance, for former gang members, I think for everybody, we want to cultivate compassion so much that we imagine the parameter of the sphere of our concern just expanding and expanding and expanding until nobody is excluded from it anymore. And I think that that's really the picture of justice that I want to gravitate towards.
So let's talk a little bit about the Cyntoia Brown story, because it's a compelling story. It got into, the mainstream media. It got picked up by celebrities. She became a cause celeb. Um, and yet, in a lot of ways, she's not that unusual, at least in terms of how she got into the prison in the first place. I think, the second part of her story, it is unusual. But I mean, talk about how she got in, and then at what point you saw her.
Well, Centoya, you're right. Her story, it mirrors, I think, a lot of other very, very sad, heartbreaking, tragic stories where a child, um, through no fault of its own, is born into a situation where there is, addiction and abuse, mental health issues, neglect, trauma, and we know the old saying that hurt people hurt people. And when you've got a child who, from their earliest memories, is suffering, um, for whom violence is just sort of, a fairly regular part of their lives, it should not surprise us when that person acts violently themselves. And that's what happened with Cyntoia. But it was a long journey, for her. I mean, she ran away from home. She was living on the streets. What we now know that we didn't know years ago when her case was first being tried is that she was a victim of sex trafficking. Back then, in the early 2000s, we hadn't started talking as much about that. We were still sort of hung up on teen prostitute, which is how she was talked about in the media. But we know now and have passed laws. Some states have passed laws protecting victims of trafficking when they act violently against their trafficker, their abuser. And that's basically what we had in Cyntoia's case. And unfortunately, yes, like you said, I mean, her case it's sort of a microcosm, of all these things, these conditions that we know produce violence. It was like a perfect storm. And so she was convicted of killing a man. In Tennessee, if you are found guilty of first-degree murder, the least sentence you're going to get is 51 years, and that's what she got as a 16-year-old child. So the state of Tennessee told her that they were throwing her away, and she would have no chance of being released until she was at least 67 years old. By the time I met her in that prison classroom in the college program, she had already served, I think, about 5 or so years. And so she was in her early 20s. And already, I mean, a 16-year-old is very different from a person who's 21, 22 years old. She had already done a lot of growing up and a lot of maturing. And I think she had turned over a new leaf. I mean, she had gone from dropping out of school and running away from home to wanting to pursue higher education. She was very excited to be in a college classroom reading, scholarly works, and she was looking for community. And what we had was a vital academic community that she was a very, very important member of.
And the program that you were part of is really unique. Um, you know, I'm out in California, and there's a lot of higher education now in the prisons, thank goodness. But nothing really like that. And there are several levels to that, to the uniqueness. You had half of the class from the outside going in, and then half of the class being on the inside, and that was an interesting dynamic. I think it was in your book where you talked about how they scared the hell out of the students that were coming in, and finally somebody cracked the joke that, hey, I'm afraid that I'm going to get taken hostage or something.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it was when Dr. Richard Good, who's a professor at Lipscomb in the history department, who was one of my professors when I was a student there. He had this vision to start this prison program. At the time, that was 2006 when he first started talking about it and planning it. And man, it was a lot different than it is now. There weren't a lot of prison programs anywhere. The Pell Grants, were gone. So if folks who were incarcerated were wanting to get college education, they had to do correspondence courses. But Richard Good had this vision for let's go offer, because Lipscomb is a Christian school. I should say it markets itself as a Christian school. I don't know to what degree a school can be Christian, but it certainly markets itself that way, and attempts, I think, to try to live out some faithfulness to the Christian witness. And Richard's perspective was, well, if that's true, if that's what we're going to say about ourselves, then Jesus talked about the responsibility that his followers had to visit people who were incarcerated. And as an academic institution, that means taking your gifts, whatever you're offering, which is scholarship, study, out to the prison and making it available to people who otherwise don't have it. But Richard also recognized that as compelling as that is, it would be even better if he took traditional college kids out to the prison to have class alongside these folks who lived at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And yeah, I mean, that turns your world upside down. I mean, those fences and razor wire and gates don't just keep people locked in, they keep the rest of us locked out so that we can't bear witness to what's happening in there. And once those college kids went in there, it really did. It spun some of them like a top. It scared some of them to death, to go through the orientation, just to be there with the imposing walls and the guards and the metal detectors that you go through. But what they found, just like me, what we found when we got in that classroom is people who were just like us. They weren't maybe raised the same. They had trauma that we had not had to deal with, but they watched the same television shows, they listened to the same music. And I think that Richard's vision then became a reality where whatever we were studying, whether it was judicial process in my class, or whether it was a science class or a math class or a literature class, the beauty of what was happening there is outside students and inside students becoming friends with one another. I mean, that was the real beauty of the program.
Yeah, fair to say, this is a Southern community and a relatively conservative student group. So it's really culture shock for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There was one kid who the first night of class, he had driven out to the prison and he got to the parking lot and he saw all that fencing and the razor wire looped around, and poor guy never got out of his car. He just turned around in the parking lot and headed straight back to the Lipscomb campus. And we didn't see him until the next week, when he kind of came in and apologized for missing the first class, and it was that intimidating for him. But, the inside students, they were intimidated too. I mean, a bunch of them, I don't know if any of them had been in a college classroom before. A lot of them, their families, they were the first person in their family to be enrolled in college. And here come these traditional kids, who are basically professional students who do this all day, every day. And I think some of the inside students wondered, are we going to be able to hack it? I mean, are we going to be able to keep up with these kids? Some of them had been to school in 30 years. But man, I mean, they absolutely knocked the top out. They were absolutely brilliant.
And so from your perspective, you're a teacher, but you're the student at the same time, right? I mean, it's an interesting dynamic.
You know, when I got involved in that program, I was exactly 30 years old. Um, and I thought that I pretty well had things figured out. I had been a prosecutor in the system for a while. I'd been to law school. I'd clerked for a judge for a couple of years and thought I pretty well had my ducks in a row. Um, and got out to the prison and found out just how little I knew, how little I knew about the system, because I had always studied it from a safe, sterile, distance. Um, but found out how, I mean, how insulated I had been from suffering, from trauma, from violence, and started to rethink things about my vocation, why I had become a prosecutor in the first place, and about my faith. Again, why is it that people of faith are so quick on Sunday morning to sing and talk and pray and read and preach about forgiveness and redemption and second chances and mercy? And it's just such good news. That's the good news. And then Monday through Friday, it sort of goes out the window, and we are perfectly comfortable living in a culture that is largely punitive and retributive, and even like I was, sort of an agent of a system that is built on what I would say institutionalized vengeance. So the cognitive dissonance just got to be more than I could handle.
Um, and from reading the book, it's kind of hard to tell, but was it actually the experience of going into that prison and interacting that started to change you, or were you starting to change before and this just accelerated things?
I think that as a a person in my 20s, I think everybody probably, hopefully, most people, as they mature through their 20s, start to sort of rethink some things. I mean, whatever you've inherited from your parents, hopefully you sort of examine it a little more carefully through your 20s and make it your own or reject it or change it, whatever. I think once I was sort of back in close contact with Professor Richard Good, and he started sort of preparing me because I'd never taught a college class before. So he was real good to give me some pointers, things I should think about for fostering good discussion. He gave me a couple of books, one of which I mean, it's in my book. It appears pretty heavily, called Changing Lenses by Howard Zier. I had never read anything. I had never read a critique of the criminal justice system before, so that sowed some seeds. But really, it was going into the prison and finding people that were so full of grace, and so profoundly gifted, and I was rooting for them. I would have written any of them a letter of recommendation. Be happy to have any of them move into my neighborhood. Um, as some folks have come home, I've had them over to my house. I hang out with them. I was with someone yesterday for breakfast, who I had in a classroom, when he was still serving a life sentence. Those sorts of experiences, just that these tectonic plates shifting, that this is not what I thought it was. These people are not who I thought they were. Why did I ever feel comfortable making arguments about the fate of people that I didn't know? I can't write another brief. I can't keep doing this job.
So tell us what your thought process was when you wrote the brief in the Cyntoia Brown case, and then what happened?
I remember that case. I've had a lot of time to think about it. I remember the case. I remember it was a big case. I remember that the record, which means like the transcript of the trial and all the exhibits that got introduced at the trial, and all of the paperwork and exhibits and everything took up a banker's box, so it was a lot of paper. It was a big case. Um, I remember the issues. I remember that, one of the issues was whether a 16-year-old, whether she was properly transferred to adult court. I remember one of the issues had to do with whether the state had proven premeditation, or whether she may have been acting in self-defense. Saying I remember the case, but it was just another case. And I'm ashamed to say it that way, but that's just the truth of the matter, that prosecutors are doing a job, and we're dealing with tragic tragic events that sometimes permanently alter the course of people's lives. But and I felt the gravity of that as a prosecutor. It's not that I was flippant, but at the same time, it was a case. And when I finished my brief and I made my argument to the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals, I had another case after it that I needed to work on. And so I then moved on to the next case. And I don't know what the next case might have been, a DUI case, but it also might have been an aggravated assault or a rape case, or a burglary case. There's always one more. It's like an assembly line. You do your thing, you move on, you do it again. And so, I wrote the brief and then I just kind of moved on. And I think that moving on, that lawyers, prosecutors, probably judges have to do, is why when she showed up as a student in the class that I was teaching, I never caught that Cyntoia Brown in my class was the Cyntoia Brown with a banker's box of records in the case that I worked on in the brief that I wrote. It was a remote possibility in my mind, I guess, but it was such an abstraction. I mean, there's 30,000 people locked up in Tennessee. What is the likelihood that somebody whose case I worked on is going to then show up as one of the 15 people in my class, you know. So I just didn't really allow for the possibility. I wasn't looking for it. And so she showed up in my class, and we got the class started, you know. And I wasn't thinking about what she had done, why she was there. She was just Cyntoia Brown in my class, brilliant, funny, articulate, eager to learn, excited about learning, loved to read. And she was just, you know, one of those people that makes a class special.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things. For me, I mean, on the one hand, I guess Centoya is not the most typical first name, so that might have caught my attention. But I could see myself doing the exact same thing as you, not connecting the two. The other thing that you said that's kind of interesting is I never ever ask the people I work with what they did. If they want to talk about it, that's fine. But you know, I don't go, oh, what are you in for? I don't feel like that's the right thing to do. And the other thing that really caught my attention in the interchange was her reaction was kind of your reaction was, yeah, I get it. You had a job to do. She didn't really take it personally, did she?
You know, her response was remarkable. Now, she had had about a week to sort of prepare herself because she received the opinion. Actually, I received the opinion first and came to class thinking that she would have seen the opinion and that all hell might be about to break loose. But she had not seen the opinion. And maybe I was cowardly. I don't know if I chickened out. You know, in the moment, I just didn't feel comfortable being the one to break that news to her, you know, that, well, your appeal has been denied. Oh, and by the way, I was the lawyer for the state, you know, arguing that it needed to be denied. She was going to find out. I did not feel comfortable in that moment being the one to tell her, but it made for a long week because I knew that by the time we had another class, she definitely would have seen the opinion and seen my name on it. And sure enough, we got there the next Wednesday night, and she was waiting for me in the hallway outside our classroom. And she said that now she understood why I had kind of asked the previous week whether she was okay, you know, because she now knew that I thought that she had read the opinion. And I just apologized profusely. I mean, the way that you would do when you really feel like you have betrayed someone, when you've betrayed someone's trust, when you've let someone down, because, you know, at that point we had been in class together for several weeks and we had gotten to know each other and shared books and laughed together. She's got a great sense of humor, and I enjoy, you know, kidding around with people. And we had some camaraderie, and I could tell she was hurt. You know, but she told me, you know, she said, you know, when I first got the opinion, you know, she said, I was of course shocked, you know, she felt, you know, a certain way about it, but, you know, she did then kind of after the shock wore off, you know, and those feelings kind of thawed a little bit, and she recognized that I had been doing a job, you know, that at the time I worked on that case, that I didn't know her any more than I knew, you know, anybody else. And she also knew that I had left that position, that it had gotten to the point, you know, for me that I did not feel comfortable carrying on in that position as an appellate prosecutor. And I think she kind of recognized, you know, well, I'm not going to, uh, you know, dress him down for something that he's already sort of recognized he was in the wrong about. But she dealt with me so graciously, and ultimately affirmed. She said, you know, we are friends. We may have some things to work through, but you know, we're going to continue. And we did. You know, we did have some things to work through, but we were able to come to a point where we recognized where she recognized that I was more than being a prosecutor. And I was certainly able to recognize, that she is more than anything that was said in a trial transcript or in the media, that she is this, again, profoundly gifted, good person with so much to offer the world.
So I don't know if this is a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. And that is, looking back on what you wrote at that time, how would you do it differently, or is the only answer that you could possibly have to quit?
Well, it's kind of like, again, I liken it to an assembly line where the the judge, the police, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, we're all doing this little job, where we maybe tighten our little bolt. By the time I got the case, there had already been a trial. A jury had already found Cyntoia guilty. The judge had already imposed a 51-year sentence. It goes up on appeal. There's no new jury. There's no new analysis of any facts. It's just a matter of, okay, she gets to raise issues on appeal that she think implicate the fairness of the trial. And it's my job to just say, from the state's point of view, whether or not those issues have merit, And if I had gone to my boss, the deputy there in the attorney general's office, and said, I don't feel good about this. If there had been some sort of an error in the case, then my boss would have said, well, you need to concede in court that there was an error. And if it was a significant error, then you need to recommend reversal so that they can correct the error. But there wasn't anything like that. What I would have been doing is saying, you know what? I don't feel good about the outcome in this case. This was a 16-year-old child. She doesn't deserve 51 years. And my supervisor would have said, but that's the law. The law was applied. It's not our job to question whether it's right or fair. And if I had kept it up, she said, you know what? She would have said, somebody else is going to work on that. You seem to be having a problem with that case. We're going to hand that off to someone else. You now work on this other case. So I mean, it's like if you're on the assembly line and you say, I really don't feel good about the way that I'm tightening this bolt, then the foreman is going to say, well, you can either do it the way we've told you to, or we'll find somebody else to do it. And if you then take issue with the whole line, if you say this whole line seems to be problematic, I don't feel good about the cars we're producing. And at that point, you're not here for quality control, man. Tighten your bolt or hit the bricks. That, I feel like, is kind of where I was.
Yeah, and I think that's the core of the problem here, right? Because on some level, I think we can look back on this case and go, man, this is a 16-year-old. She was abused. She was trafficked, and we're giving her a life sentence when she didn't handle things maybe the right way, or maybe she overreacted, or maybe she thought she was acting in self-defense. I don't know. It's hard to tell even from her account. But what I do know is that the outcome doesn't work in my world. And so, and this is what we see over and over again in the criminal legal system. You could be wrongly convicted, and if there's no errors that happen, it just, 12 people decided the wrong way. There's nothing anybody can do other than maybe the governor.
I feel like it is so important for people who aren't in this world to understand that. People need to understand, even if you don't know anything else about the process, you need to understand that an innocent person, once they are convicted, if they can't demonstrate that there was some sort of a breakdown in the process, they are not going to get out of prison. Because you can't just go into an appeals court and say, I didn't do it. I'm factually innocent. They're going to say, well, show us where the process broke down, because justice in our system is defined in terms of process. That's what we mean when we say due process. How much process are you due? well, you're entitled to a jury. That's part of the process you're entitled to. So if they tried to convict you without a jury, that would be a problem. Hearsay should not be used against you. That's part of the process. And warrants have to be based on probable cause. But if you can't check a box somewhere and say, this part of the process wasn't done right, we have a lot of innocent people in prisons right now who've been in there for decades because they haven't been able to demonstrate to a court there was a breakdown in the process. And the fact that they are innocent does not matter because when justice is defined in terms of process, and guilty people sometimes get out. I tell a story in the book about a guilty person who went free because they were not properly advised of their constitutional rights. And most people would object, well, guilty people shouldn't go free. But if justice is defined in terms of process, then when the process is not followed, you let the guilty person go. If the process is followed, you can keep the innocent person locked up. It is a terrible way to approach the question of doing justice.
And so ultimately you arrive and move to a very different place from where you started. And and the book is really about that journey. And it's really fascinating for somebody like me to read it. And I'll be honest, I'm an atheist. I was raised Jewish. I'm from liberal California. So on the surface, you and I would be very different. And yet, at the end of your book, you're pretty close to where I am.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate you reading the book because faith is a part of it because faith has been a part of my story, how my faith has changed and evolved and what I feel like it has motivated me towards. But I certainly hope that doesn't discourage people from reading it. I don't want it to be a Christian book. I don't want it to be exclusively available from Christian publishers or in Christian bookstores. I want people of other faiths and no faith to read it because whether it's faith or just your sense of values and what is important to you, we all need to have like these guiding lights, principles, for which we will go to the mat. And when we start to feel like we're sort of at odds with some of those principles, or maybe we're being called upon to do something that causes us that cognitive dissonance that I mentioned. To use religious language, that's an opportunity to repent. That's an opportunity to turn away, to turn in a new direction and think differently about things. Because I went into my job as a prosecutor, went to law school to be a prosecutor thinking that the system worked and that people who broke the law needed to be punished. And that's what justice was. It was tantamount to punishment. And I had to change my mind. And changing your mind can be uncomfortable. It can be humiliating. I have felt humiliated at times over parts of my journey, but it's kind of like jumping off the high dive. It's like you have to work your courage up, and it's like, oh my goodness, but once you do it, it's like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad at all. And now next time I'm wrong, because it's going to happen again, I won't be so afraid to say publicly, well, I was wrong about this, because I'm still just trying to navigate, my ideals, have my practice line up with my beliefs about what's good.
And I guess the other remarkable part is your wife kind of went on this journey with you, and backed you up.
Well, thank you. I should have mentioned her before now, so thank you for mentioning my wife, Charisse. She and my children um, figure prominently in this book because this was not a journey that I took on my own. By the time I started unraveling, uh, I had two kids. I was going to have a third. Charisse stayed home with our kids, making huge sacrifices because she wanted to be home with the little ones. And she didn't sign up for any of this angst, you know. She but at every turn, and I talk about it being a current. I feel like I tried to chart a path because that's what we tell people to do. You know, you decide where you're going to college, you declare a major and pick a job, blaze your path, you know. And I tried that, but I got knocked off of it. I think the universe, you know, recognized that was not the path I needed to be on, and I kind of fell into a current that was not of my own making, and I just had to try to keep discerning where the current was going and not swim against it. But Charisse was such a faithful, wise companion in helping me trust the current and not to be afraid when it took me places that I would not have chosen to go myself. And trusting that it was going to be okay. You know, that walking away from the career I'd chosen for myself, walking away from the church where we raised our kids when it became clear that's what needed to happen, taking a stand when Lipscomb, which had a special place in my heart, not just because of the life program, but for a whole host of reasons, when I felt like it had engaged in just overtly racist behavior towards one of its employees. Charisse was right there saying, "You've got to speak about this, even though it's going to mean probably never teaching for Lipscomb again." So she is very bold and courageous and wise and discerning. And I wouldn't have been able to do any of this without her support.
Yeah, and that definitely comes through, and I can relate because I've had my own experiences, similar and yet different from yours. And so what are you doing now?
So once I left the Attorney General's office, I continued to teach, and gradually word kind of got out around Nashville. Nashville's not a huge town. Folks tend to know one another. And word started getting out that, you know, this prosecutor had left his job based on the friendships he made with folks who were caged. I started getting invited to go a few places. The Children's Defense Fund had me come speak at their annual conference, and um, one thing sort of led to another, the way that things do when you're in a current. And I started getting more and more involved in criminal justice reform work and being asked to share the perspective of a former prosecutor. Why would a prosecutor all of a sudden lose faith in the system? You know, people wanted to hear about that. They thought that was interesting. And I got involved with an organization called the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, which is a juvenile sentencing reform organization that is focused on eliminating life without parole for children and other extreme sentences, like exactly what, you know, Cyntoia Brown was dealing with. Um, my involvement with them got to such a degree that in 2019 they asked me to come on board and lead their legislative advocacy work. And so since that time, the past 5+ years, I have been going around to state capitals around the country, talking to lawmakers and prosecutors and other policy people and other advocates about how urgently we need to pass reforms that eliminate these extreme adult sentences being imposed against teenagers who don't even have fully functioning brains, and instead offer hold kids accountable in age appropriate ways that are trauma informed, and use it. And we can use the Cyntoia Brown case as an example. You know, I think for a lot of people, once Kim Kardashian and LeBron James and Rihanna started tweeting about it, that started, you know, getting people thinking, well, what do kids need? You know, we don't need to throw them away. What do they need? Well, they need help. Cyntoia needed help, you know, and so we want to hold people accountable, yes, but in age appropriate ways that take into account the trauma they have sustained and try to heal it. Because in the same way that hurt people, we also know that healed people heal people. And when you give kids a second chance, you know, at that redemption story, they come home and they do incredible work. And you can, Cyntoia's doing it now. I have so many friends who are uniquely equipped to make their communities stronger and safer because they know what needs to be done to help those kids.
Yeah, you know, in Cyntoia's case, I mean, reading that book, it was just so stark how little help she was getting from adults. And it really, to me, what pushed her over the edge was getting kicked out of school at what, 12 or 13 for having no-dos, in her backpack. I mean, the absurdity of it all, and that spirals her into this life that she couldn't control for another 10 years.
Well, again, I think that her case sort of mirrors back to us some of our worst tendencies. And one of those is, and I just hope that if people don't remember anything else, maybe they'll remember something like this. We act as though there is not a social problem that we can't punish our way out of. We think that we can punish our way out of, kids causing mischief. We think that we can punish our way out of addiction. So instead of treating addiction as a public health concern, we punish it. Mental health issues, we don't offer adequate treatment. We just punish. We want to punish poverty. So we pass laws about, sleeping in public. We basically criminalize homelessness, and we make it a crime for some people to just exist. Punish, 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 punish. Make protesting illegal. Instead of listening to what people are protesting about, we will pass laws saying, that you can't protest, in certain ways or whatever. And we've got to get past this point of thinking that punishment is going to solve problems, because we are only making things worse when you criminalize these sorts of issues. And so many of them, again, it's like this perfect storm, and when dropping out of school, for whatever reason leads to punishment, well, you're already moving your way around this spiral, or if you've got someone who has mental health issues and they self-medicate the way that we know people do, and you criminalize self-medicating, you have now moved them further around the spiral. So we've got to interrupt that, not just exacerbate it.
All right. Well, we're out of time. Thank you, Preston, for coming on. Thank you for writing this book. I think it's a really important book, and it can reach a lot of people that maybe the traditional criminal justice reform book doesn't reach. I have a very good friend of mine from college who's a pastor. And after reading this, I thought of him and I made him go get it. So I'll find out how he reacts, but I feel like he's a guy that would benefit from going into prisons and working with people that are incarcerated.
Unfortunately, sometimes pastors are a lot like prosecutors. They don't. It doesn't cross their mind to go be with people who are caged. So thank you for reading it. Thank you for boosting my signal, and thank you for this time.
This has been Everyday Injustice. We've been talking with Preston Shipp. He's a former prosecutor from Tennessee. He was with the Attorney General's office, and he wrote the great book, Confessions of a Former Prosecutor. I strongly recommend you getting it. You can get it at Amazon or anywhere where books are sold. It's a very powerful testament and a voice that we don't hear enough of.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.